Erev Tov, everybody. Welcome to another edition of our Thursday night Parashat HaShavua class. Tonight we are studying Parashat Toledot, Ele Toledot Yitzchak ben Avraham. What an amazing parasha. We have so much incredible things. Of course, the birth of Yaakov and Esav, the blessings that Yaakov takes from Esav, the sale of the firstborn rights from Esav to Yaakov, so on and so forth. It is a jam-packed parasha. And today, I'd like to spend some time with you looking at the parasha in a different light. And hopefully, Bezrat Hashem, by the time we're done here, have a new understanding of what is taking place in one pasuk of this parasha and how it affects our lives, not just now, but as we move forward, and even Ad 120 Shana, for Techiyat HaMetim, when we come back to life in the days of Mashiach. In Parashat Toledot, the parasha begins with a pasuk that says, Vayhi Yitzchak ben 40 Shana, Bekachto et Rivka, Bat Betuel ha'arami, Mipadan Aram, Achot Lavan ha'arami lo leisha. Yitzchak was 40 years old when he took Rivka, the daughter of Betuel ha'arami, from Padan Aram, the sister of Lavan, to be his wife. On a very simple level, this pasuk is just telling us exactly what I translated. Yitzchak was 40 years old. That's when he married Rivka. Rivka was a daughter of Betuel the Arami. She was a sister of Lavan and took her as a wife. But we know that the Torah is elucidated on 4 different levels. We call this Pardes. Pardes refers to Pei, Reish, Dalet, Samech. Pei is the Peshat, the straightforward, simple interpretation like I just translated. The Remez is the allusions, many times includes Gematriot and Rashi Tevot, acronyms. Derash is more elaborate elucidations, sometimes including stories. And of course, last but not least is Sod. Sod is the mystical and hidden meanings of the text. And the source of this concept is found in the teachings of the Arizal, where he lists the items that we are all required to fulfill. And he adds there that a person has to strive in his life to engage in each of these 4 levels of Torah study, each one according to his abilities. And a person needs to seek someone suitable to teach him that. And if a person lacks any of these 4, he says very harsh words. He is sure to reincarnate as a consequence. Meaning, if you only spent your life learning the pshat, the simple text, and you totally ignored the drash or the remez or the sod, that's not good. You're going to have to come back a different time to study and make up what you missed. So I want to look at this pasuk that I started off tonight in a different light. It's fitting to examine the elucidation of this pasuk that is brought down in the Zohar HaKadosh. The Zohar represents the planes of Remez and Sod. This pasuk is seen as an allusion, with an A, to the time of Mashiach, the future redemption. 40 years after the redemption, the Jewish people will merit the resurrection of the dead, Techiyat HaMetim. And the Neshama will return to re-enter the body and bring it back to life. And according to the Zohar, this is what the pasuk means. Vayhi Yitzchak ben 40 Shana. Yitzchak alludes to the Neshama that will return and re-enter the body ben 40 Shana, 40 years after. Rivka alludes to the physical body that will be resurrected. Bat Betuel ha'arami, the daughter of Betuel ha'arami, is an allusion to the fact that the physical body will rise and be revitalized in the merit of a single bone that does not decay in the grave and remains intact. This bone is referred to as Betuel ha'arami, according to the Zohar. The body is destined to be rebuilt from this particular bone at the time of resurrection. And therefore, the body is called Bat Betuel ha'arami, the daughter of Betuel Arami, since it regenerates from the bony entity known as Betuel Arami. And that's how the Zohar elucidates this pasuk. Further in the Zohar writes something incredible. And he states that he quoting in the name of Rav Huna. Rav Huna was one of the rabbis who lived in the time of the Gemara. He was one of the Amoraim. And Rav Huna states that he was once in a city by the sea. And he heard people referring to the bone in the spinal column that remains in the grave after the body is gone as Betuel Ha'arami. Betuel, the fraud. Ha'arami means the deceiver. And after inquiring, he was told that this bone has the shape of a snake's head. And just like the snake is deceptive and fraudulent, so too this bone is the most fraudulent bone in the body. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught that this bone remains in existence long after the other bones, because it deceptively does not partake from human consumption as the other bones do, as we're going to talk about. As a consequence, it remains strong and is the essential building block for the resurrection of the body. Then Rabbi Shimon taught us that it's a fraud, the bone. It was always a fraud and was the neighbor of the deceptive and fraudulent Yetzer Hara. This is what the Zohar writes. As you can imagine, there's a lot going on over here. And like I said, I hope by the time we're done tonight, we'll have a better idea of what this bone is all about. Of course, all the commentaries in the Zohar are baffled by the fact that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai chooses to refer to this unique bone, the basis of the resurrection, the basis of Techiyat HaMetim, as Betuel Ha'arami. Betuel Ha'arami. It's a fraud. It was always a fraud. Question number one is, why is it a fraud? More than that, if it is a fraud, how does it merit remaining intact and constituting the building block from which the Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, is going to begin? More than that, the Zohar initially interprets Bat Betuel, the daughter of Betuel, as the granddaughter of God. That's what Betuel means. Bito El, the daughter of God. So therefore, the daughter of Betuel is the granddaughter of God, which is an honorable title if you think about it, to be the daughter of God, or at least a granddaughter of God. Why then does the Zohar conclude that this bone, referred to as Betuel Arami, is a fraud and was always a fraud? Okay, so those are our questions. So first we need to indulge in the marvelous statements of our Chachamim in the Talmud and the Midrash concerning the nature of this bone that I'm talking about, the unique bone. Why does this bone merit to remain intact and unscathed, and as a consequence is able to serve as the seed, kibiyachol, for man's resurrection, Techiyat HaMetim? So we find a source for this in the Midrash in Parashat Bereshit at the end. There the Midrash writes, and I quote, Vayomer Hashem emche et ha'adam. At the end, when God saw that the world was corrupt and he wanted to destroy the world by a flood, right before Noach, Rabbi Yochanan b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Yatztak amar, Afilu luz shel shidra. Even the bone, the luz on the vertebrae, that's the name of the bone. Shemimenu HaKadosh Baruch Hu metzitz et ha'adam le'atid lavo nimche. That bone where God is going to use to resurrect the world, to resurrect the people in the time of Techiyat HaMetim, that bone will also disintegrate when he destroys the world. In fact, this bone has such powers that Adrianus once asked about it to Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah, and he asked, where is your God going to resurrect the dead from? And he told him, from this bone, the luz sheshidra. So he went and he found the bone, I guess, of someone that passed away. And he tried grinding it. He tried dissolving it. He tried burning it. He tried pulverizing it, and he couldn't do anything. It remained intact. Unbelievable. So, this midrash, which concerning the generation of the flood, the bone from which HaKadosh Baruch Hu will resurrect the dead in the future is called luz shel shidra, the luz of the spinal column. It is invulnerable. Whether you attempt to grind it or burn it or pulverize it, it remains intact. And this bone has very, very special importance. Our rabbis tell us that the luz shel shidra shehi chulia ktana shebashidra shebaberachot. It is the small vertebrae at the tip of the spinal column that in reference to the blessings. What does it mean, the blessings? So, I should inform you of a Gemara in Masechet Brachot that asks a question. Why did the rabbis institute 18 blessings in Shmona Esrei? In our Amidah, why are there 18 blessings? And the answer that one of the answers that's given is Keneged Shmona Esrei Chuliot Shebashidra. It corresponds to the 18 vertebrae in the spine. 18 blessings, 18 vertebrae. At which point the Gemara asks, Hanitam Nisari? Tishasari Havian. Why do you say that there's 18 blessings in our Amidah, when in reality there are 19 blessings? If you were to open the Siddur right now and count the blessings of our Amidah, you will find that there are 19. There are not 18 blessings. So that's what the Gemara's question is. Why do you say 18? It should be 19. And the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Levi, Birkat HaTzidukim, the blessing of the Tzidukim, which we call Laminim V'Lamalshinim, that blessing, Beyavne Tiknuha. That blessing was instituted later on in the city of Yavne. And then the Gemara asks, Keneged mi tiknuha? According to what? What is corresponding to that blessing? You told me that the 18 blessings are the 18 vertebrae in the spine. So now you have a 19th blessing. What does it correspond to? And the Gemara answers, Keneged chulia ktana shebashidra. In addition to the 18 vertebrae, there exists one more small vertebrae. And the bracha of laminim v'lamalshinim al tikva, that there should be no more hope for the informers, it was instituted to correspond to that vertebrae. The Chachamim explain that this small spinal vertebrae that the Gemara talks about, which corresponds to the 19th bracha, is none other than this luz bone. This bone called luz, located in the spinal column. And it's this bone that the Midrash stated that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to use to resurrect man from in the future times. In fact, there's another place that it writes that this tiny vertebrae at the end of the column, right after the 18 vertebrae, the entire human body decays except for this one bone, and it resembles a shaked. Remember, it resembles an almond. Nevertheless, according to this explanation, number one, why were there only 18 blessings instituted to begin with? And if it was unnecessary to institute a bracha corresponding to this tiny bone, then why was the bracha of laminim v'lamalshinim, the heretics, the blessing of the heretics, why was it added corresponding to this tiny vertebrae after heresy became so prevalent? What is the connection between this loose bone and the bracha addressing the heretics? So that's another thing we have to put in our back of our mind that we're going to answer tonight. We need to uncover one more fact, one more very important fact concerning this bone that remains intact and from which HaKadosh Baruch Hu will initiate the Techiyat HaMetim. There is a halacha in Shulchan Aruch that is actually taken from a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat that talks about the mitzvah of Melave Malka, which is the fourth meal that a person has after Shabbat. On Shabbat, you're supposed to have 3 meals: Friday night, Shabbat morning, and Seudah Shalishit. And then you have Seudah Revi'it, the 4th meal, which is Motzei Shabbat, and it's called Melave Malka. And there Shulchan Aruch writes the following, Le'olam yesader adam shulchano b'motzei Shabbat. A person should always set aside his table on Motzei Shabbat, kedei lelavot et Shabbat, to accompany out the Shabbat. Afilu eno tzarich ela kazait. Even if he only wants to eat a small amount of a kazait, that's all he needs. But he's got to set his table. The Bet Yosef explains the reason for this practice. And he writes, Ever yesh ba'adam, there is a limb, a human limb in the body, veniskoi shemo. And the name of this limb is niskoi. Ve'eno nehene ba'achila ela b'motzei Shabbat. This bone, this limb, does not derive any benefit from one's meals except on Motzei Shabbat. Now, this bone is the same bone that we've been talking about, the luz bone. Ki yadua, and I quote a perush, Ki yadua she'oto etzem luz shemei. We know that this bone that Shulchan Aruch is talking about, his name is luz. Vehu itzumo ve'ikaro ve'shorsho. It is the central part of the existence of man. Nitava adam be'etzem atipa. Ve'ka'asher yamut ha'adam, and when man will die, ha'etzem ha'u eno nimoach ve'lo nifchat. This bone will not diminish, it will not disintegrate, it will not lessen. Ve'ilu yachnisu oto ba'esh eno nisraf, and if you put in fire, it will not burn. Barechaim eno nitchan, it will not be ground if you put it into a mill. Ve'hu ha'etzem sheyesh bo kiyum nitzchi. It's a bone that is eternal. Umimenu yichya adam le'et ha'techaya, and that is where man will resurrect from. So, this bone survives all of eternity. It's a seed for man's resurrection. It receives man's reward and punishment after death. This bone has heavenly origins. And now, after discussing all this and going on, it even says that a person who is careful to observe this practice, the Melave Malka meal, and nourish this bone with that food that only nourishes on Motzei Shabbat, he will enjoy the rewards and the delights and all the sachar for the righteous people. So let's summarize what we have so far, and then we're going to answer all this. Number one, we have this concept that the Zohar refers to this special bone as Betuel Ha'arami because of its fraudulent, deceptive behavior. The second thing we spoke about so far is that the Midrash refers to it as the luz bone in the spine because it's indestructible. The third thing we said was that the Gemara refers to it as a small vertebrae in the spine, and the 19th vertebrae corresponding to the 19th bracha, laminim v'lamalshinim. And the last thing we explained was that the scholars call this also niskoi, and it does not derive any benefit from our food that we partake during the week. It only derives benefit from the food that is eaten on Motzei Shabbat. We've also posed two questions. Number one, what about this bone is fraudulent, earning the title Betuel Ha'arami, Arami the fraudulent one? And why was the bracha concerning the heretics, the laminim and malshinim, specifically instituted corresponding to this vertebrae? But let's add one more question. How do we explain the incredible fact that this bone does not derive benefit from any food other than what's eaten on Motzei Shabbat in the meal of the Melave Malka? To answer these questions, we have to look at the great Ya'avetz, Rabbi Yaakov Emden ben Tzvi, and his Sidur. He has one of the great Pirushim on the Sidur. And he writes, it's imperative that every Torah scholar be aware and review this to understand, to a small degree even, the significance of this bone, this luz bone which is located in our body. What does he say? During the process of creation, God created man's physical form, his body. The Torah writes, Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam afar min ha'adama. And Hashem, God, formed man from soil, from the soil of the earth. Vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim, and he blew into his nostrils the soul of life. Vahi adam lenefesh chaya, and man became a living soul. In truth, after the sin of the Etz Hadat, the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge, the reality of death was decreed and imposed upon all living creatures. Nevertheless, since man does not utilize his physical body to perform mitzvot, and since man does utilize his body to perform mitzvot and good deeds, Hashem wanted to resurrect the very same body rather than create an entirely new body. And that's why HaKadosh Baruch Hu prepared the remedy prior to the malady. He created the medicine before he brought the sickness. And he created a unique entity within the physical body called the loose bone. And this bone stands apart from all other physical parts and structures of the body in that it's composed of a unique material not made up of the four basic elements of fire, water, wind, and earth. It does not derive benefit from any food substance, so that its existence is not dependent on any physical nourishment or sustenance. And that's why it exists for all eternity. It doesn't decay. It's not consumed by fire. It serves as the building block to which HaKadosh Baruch Hu will build a person anew, again, during Techiyat HaMetim, resurrection of the dead. Says the Ya'avetz, he explains why the Zohar HaKadosh refers to this bone as Betuel Ha'aramim. He gives two reasons. Number one, the bone fools the body into thinking that it's being nourished physically like the rest of the body, when in reality it doesn't derive any physical benefit from one's food and drink. That's way number one, that it acts in deceit and fraud. Number two, it deceptively appears to die along with the rest of the body, when in reality it continues to live and exist long after a person died. In fact, there's a beautiful remez, a numerical allusion to this fact in the name Betuel. Betuel, which we're saying Betuel Arami, is the name for this bone. Betuel, the gematria of Betuel is 439, which is one number less than the numerical equivalent of the word met. Met is 440. Met means dead. Meaning this gematria alludes to the fact that this bone only appears to die, but in reality it continues to live on completely intact. Rabotai, this is why this bone only derives benefit from the melave malka meal on Motzei Shabbat. Seeing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created it in a manner that it does not require physical sustenance for it to exist, it only derives benefit from food that is consumed for the sole purpose of serving Hashem, without any physical pleasure. After going 3 meals on Shabbat, you're full, you can't even walk after Shabbat, and yet you're going to sit down one more time and you're eating food, not because you want the food, but because Hashem told you to eat the food. Because Hashem wants you to escort the Shabbat out. The sole reason you partake from food on Motzei Shabbat is to fulfill the mitzvah of accompanying out the Shabbat. He doesn't do it for physical pleasure. And that's why the loose remains, the bone remains. Yet it's still wondrous and perplexing why the loose bone is referred to as Betuel Ha'arami, which the Zohar called Betuel, the fraudulent one. Does the fact that it appears to be benefiting from one's food when in fact it's not? Or the fact that it appears to die with the rest of the body when in fact not? Does that justify calling it Betuel Arami, Betuel the fraud? Regardless of how you look at it, if its appearances are merely deceptive but it doesn't intentionally deceive, it's not a true fraud. On the other hand, if it intentionally deceives the body into thinking that it's benefiting from the food of the body, the food that the body consumes, or that it dies along with the body, then we have to explain what benefit accrues to it from this deception. How does all of this make sense with what we started the class with? The statement of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that this bone is a fraud, it was always a fraud, it's the neighbor of the Yetzer Hara, which is also a fraud. What was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai saying over there? So, we need to delve one more step deeper, if we weren't deep enough. Incredible novel interpretation concerning this passage of the Zohar as to why this bone from which man is destined to be resurrected is referred to as Betuel, the fraud. We said that the reason a person should strive to eat even a little kazait, just a small amount of food for the meal on Motzei Shabbat, is because this bone, the niskoi, does not benefit from the meal all week long. It only benefits from what you eat on Motzei Shabbat. On this, the Eliyahu Rabbah writes, Im ken, lo nehene me'etz hadat lekach eno nifsad. If so, it must be that it did not partake in the tree of knowledge. Therefore, it does not decay. What is meant by this? When Adam HaRishon ate from the tree of knowledge, all of his limbs benefited. And as a consequence, all of the limbs were doomed to return to dust and to disintegrate in the ground. This bone, however, which only benefits from Motzei Shabbat, from the meal of Melave Malka, did not partake from the fruit of the tree, because that was eaten before Shabbat. It was eaten on Friday. So the bone did not benefit because it only benefits on Motzei Shabbat. And therefore, it continues to exist without decay. And this idea is brought down in many places. Why did the loose bone refrain from partaking in the forbidden fruit? Why? The Torah tells us, Ve'hanachash haya arum mikol hayat hasadeh. The serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field. Asher asa Hashem Elokim, that Hashem, God, has made. And Unkelus on this pasuk famously writes, V'chaviyah hava hakim mikol chavat bera. That the serpent was more cunning than every beast of the wild. So this serpent, the source of deception and lies, cleverly plotted to trap Adam and Chava in his net. And this is why the serpent is called Nehash Ramai, the fraudulent serpent. And this fact is so evident from the lie that it said to Chava. The serpent, the Nachash, told Chava, Ki yodea Elokim ki beyom acholchem imenu. For God knows that on the day you eat from it, v'nifkechu einechem, your eyes will be opened, v'item kelokim, and you will be like God, yodea tovara, knowing of good and bad. And Rashi says on this pasuk, Ki yodea kol uman soneh et bene umanuto, mina etz achal ubara et haolam. The serpent said that every craftsman hates others of his crafts. And therefore, God doesn't want you to eat from that tree. God ate from that tree himself, and that's how he created the world. This is how he convinced Chava to eat. He doesn't want you to eat from it, but if you eat from it, you're going to be godly. You're going to be able to discern between good and bad. So the serpent spoke words of heresy, spoke words of lies in order to deceive Adam and Chava. This serpent, who is the Yetzer Hara, and also the Malach HaMavet, had one goal in mind. He wished to impose death on Adam and Chava and all the future descendants that came from them. He figured that if they ate from the tree of knowledge and all of their bodily limbs benefited from that fruit, then they would die a lasting, eternal death and would never be resurrected. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu thwarted his plans by introducing the remedy prior to the illness. He already created the loose bone from which man will be resurrected. The luz was aware, certainly aware, that if the serpent knew that it did not participate in eating from the tree of knowledge, then it would assault that bone with whatever negative and impure forces it had to corrupt it with heresy. And that's in fact what happened with the generation of the flood. They were so corrupt that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to wipe them out, including the loose bone, like we said before. Afilu luz shel shidra. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was nimchaeh, got rid of it. He decided to wipe out all of mankind. So when the luz witnessed the deceit and the lies of the serpent, guess what it did? It decided to follow the guidelines of the pasuk in Tehillim Yud Chet. Im chasid titchasad, im gavar tamim titamam, im navar titbarar, ve'im aikesh titpatal. With the devout, you act devoutly. With the wholehearted man, you act wholeheartedly. With the trustworthy, you act trustingly. And last but not least, with the crooked, you act perversely. Just like the serpent, the Nahash, acted cunningly and dishonestly with Adam and Chava, so too the loose bone acted cunningly and dishonestly with the serpent. It pretended that it ate from the tree of knowledge. It fooled the serpent into believing that it died along with the rest of the body. In fact, our rabbis teach us this is the exact method that we need to employ when dealing with the Yetzer Hara. Me'oivaytecha kemeni mitzvotecha. David HaMelech says in Tehillim, your commandments make me wiser than my enemies. My enemies refer to the wicked, including the Yetzer Hara, and from them I'm able to ascertain the best ways to serve God and to eagerly fulfill the mitzvot. And now we can appreciate the praise that the Torah attributes to the loose bone. It's a praise by calling it Betuel Ha'arami. The Zohar says Betuel the fraud, because the loose, that bone adopted the ways of the serpent, deceiving the serpent into thinking that it partook and benefited from the tree of knowledge, which we know it doesn't do so because that happened on Friday. And it doesn't enjoy any food on Friday or Thursday or Wednesday or Tuesday or Monday or Sunday. It's only Motzei Shabbat. And this is what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said. Hu Ramai. It is a fraud. Ume'olam haya ramai. It was always a fraud. Ve'hu hashachen shel hayetzer hara shehu ramai. And it is the neighbor of the Yetzer Hara, which is also a fraud. In other words, he acted as a colleague, as like a friend to the Yetzer Hara, learning how to act deceitfully in keeping with the tenet of imakesh titpatal. With the crooked, you act perversely. This is the reason that a blessing was not originally instituted corresponding to the small vertebrae bone known as the luz. Initially, the brachot were only instituted corresponding to the 18 brachot, the 18 vertebrae in the spine that were damaged by the sin of the chet, of the Etz Hadat, the tree of knowledge. Why? Because we needed to heal those bones. We need to heal and purify them of the contamination of the Nahash. That small vertebrae loose bone, which was not affected by the sin, didn't require healing. The reason why the luz was not harmed by the sin of the Etz Hadat is because it resisted the heresy of the serpent. Unfortunately, when heresy became prevalent, when heresy became widespread among the Jewish people, the Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the members of the Great Assembly, the men of the Great Assembly, feared that their corruption might affect the loose bone like it did at the time of Noah, before Noah, where God had to destroy the world. And therefore, to address that possibility, they had to institute an additional, a special beracha to counteract the heretics, the beracha of laminim v'lamalshinim. And therefore this beracha serves to protect the small vertebrae located in the spine known as the loose bone. And Be'ezrat Hashem, I invite you next week for part 2 of this subject, where we discover the magic that is found in this bone. Wishing everybody a wonderful night ahead.